myself, I'm Sarah Snyder. I work at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. I'm one of the assistant directors here. And I'd like to introduce you to our first webinar of the academic year. Before we get started, I just want to add that IGMAP has been working since 2017 to bring together academic and the practitioner worlds. And this webinar highlights that. So today we will be discussing Blueprint for Sustainable Peace, Practitioners' Perspective on Infrastructure for Peace in Africa, which we will be featuring Frank Osei, George Amoh, and Kwaku Danso. So we will be hearing from these experts for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A immediately following. Before I let Frank introduce the panelists and himself, I would just like to acknowledge that Binghamton University sits on the ancestral lands of the United and Onondaga people. So Frank, I will let you go ahead and take over.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and a very good morning, good afternoon to you all. And thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Before we start, I will give a brief introduction of myself and also allow the other panelists to introduce themselves, and then we can delve into the issue of the day. So without further ado, let me once again thank you all for joining us for this webinar on Blueprint for Sustainable Peace, Practitioners' Perspective on Infrastructure for Peace in Africa. My name is Frank Osei, and I am a doctoral student at the Community College of Community and Public Affairs at the Binghamton University. I also head the Peace Support Operations Program at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Ghana. I will allow my other panelists to introduce themselves. Kwaku.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Frank. And before I proceed, let me take this opportunity to first thank the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at the Binghamton University for this kind invitation to participate in this very useful interaction. Atrocity prevention, and in the particular instance of the infrastructure for peace, is still an evolving project, and therefore it is always very insightful to meet with colleagues to share ideas and reflect on this ongoing process. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Kwaku Danso, and I serve as the Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center here in Accra. My interest in issues around atrocity prevention, and for that matter, non-state avenues for peace building and conflict prevention and justice date back to my PhD work, which focuses on the role of indigenous mechanisms for ensuring justice and social cohesion, and so on and so forth. And since that, I've done a number of works related to atrocity prevention, and for that matter, infrastructure for peace, specifically in Liberia, and also to a certain degree in the Gambia. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Kwaku, and Mr. Amoh. Mr. Amoh, you are muted.
Very sorry. Thank you so much, Frank, Sarah, and the team at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. My name is George Amoh. I work here in Ghana as the Executive Secretary for the National Peace Council, which can be described as the fulcrum of infrastructure for peace in Ghana. I've served in this capacity for the past 6 years. The first 3 years as the acting executive secretary, then the last 3 years as the substantive executive secretary. I have been in the field of governance for a while in this country, started from the Human Rights Commission through to the Legal Aid Commission now under the Ministry of Justice, went to the civil society to join Transparency International. I think for now, let me leave it here and I'll hand it over to our friend, Frank.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amoh. And with that being said, I think we can now delve into the substantive issue for the day. And so let me just be brief of how the structure of this webinar will go. I will go first, and then I'll provide some background into why there's a need to discuss this issue of infrastructure for peace. And then also delve a bit deeper into what it actually is. I'll hand over to Kwaku Danso to also conceptualize it a bit further and also provide some insightful examples of peace infrastructures around the world, especially on the African continent. And then we will invite Mr. George Amoh to take us through the practical aspects of peace infrastructures, bringing his perspective from the National Peace Council there. So thank you once again for joining us. So the idea behind this webinar has been that in recent times, those who have been keenly following events unfolding on the African continent will notice that it's undergoing rapid political transformations. And this is often accompanied by instability around many places. Now, as the continent continues to undergo these transformations, we notice that the existing mechanisms for conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building are being put to the test. And so a lot of questions are currently being asked, especially in light of recent happenings on the continent. What is the African Union doing? What are regional organizations doing? What is the United Nations doing? What are national governments doing? And in light of the recent military takeovers and coup d'etats, a lot of questions are also being asked. How can this be prevented? Who is next? And so on, so forth. And so we thought it would be a great idea to delve into the essential role of mechanisms that could be leveraged to promote peace on the continent or to address these challenges that the continent is facing. But essentially, what we are seeing is that the existing institutions have proven inadequate in dealing with the challenges facing the continent. In fact, some of the institutions have actually proven to be the challenge rather than the solution. In recent times, I think we cannot discuss instability on the continent without talking about the recent coup d'etats that we are witnessing. Between 2020 and now, that is August 2023, there have been 13 attempted coups recorded in Africa. That was just between August 2020 and August 2023. About 5 African countries have so far suffered 9 successful coups in this period alone. And then we can name some of them. With 4 African countries also faced failed coup attempts. I think this is remarkable under the circumstance, given that military coups were thought to be a thing of the past. But one thing that we are also witnessing is that the existing institutions that are actually supposed to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of these African countries have also been at the forefront of these military coups. And one notable example is the presidential guards and also special forces. Some people will argue that these are post-colonial structures that were instituted to ensure the personal protection of often corrupt political leaders, and therefore it's not surprising. But these institutions were actually established to ensure also the territorial integrity of this state. So it is a bit ironic that they have turned around to instigate instability on the continent. But it is not, the instability we are witnessing is not limited to the security institutions alone. If you look at the regional and national structures for conflict prevention and management, they have also been ineffective and often generating conflicts themselves. Election-related disputes could be another instance where disputes and violence have been recorded in many places due to perceived corruption of election management bodies. But these institutions are supposed to help us ensure law and order, ensure the rule of law, ensure some semblance of stability. If you look at regional bodies, they have established early warning conflict prevention mechanisms, but the continent is still confronted with conflicts and democratic reversals. Take, for instance, the Economic Community of West African States. It has a mechanism for conflict prevention. It has another protocol on democracy and good governance, and it has a conflict prevention framework. Central Africa, there is a mechanism for the promotion and maintenance of peace and security. And there are similar structures, I will argue, in East and Southern Africa. And yet these structures have been inadequate in responding to the changing dynamics on the continent. And a lot of people have called for complete overhaul of these structures. And so several questions are currently being asked that what mechanism could best address the challenges facing the continent in recent times. And we don't have to go far. We talk about infrastructures for peace, which have now become a major tool that states and the international community are promoting to address this issue. When John Paul Lederach suggested the idea of peace infrastructures in 1997, he was thinking about an infrastructure that could leverage resources and relationships to connect society, as well as help to deal effectively with issues as they arise. And he compared this to a physical infrastructure and thought that I4P will function as a link in society that will integrate resources, relationships in an interdependent manner to promote peace. And so essentially, the creation of a peace infrastructure will strengthen the internal resources for reconciliation within society and also optimize external contributions. And this is some sort of deviation from the liberal peace building paradigm, which was more of essentially externally driven, state-centered mechanism. And so an I4P, or infrastructure for peace, was supposed to leverage the participation of local actors to build peace, whereas external actors will play a supporting role. Now, one thing we are seeing with the peace infrastructures is that it requires an amalgam of formal and informal, as well as traditional, religious, and state actors to function as a conflict prevention and resolution mechanism. Several countries have embraced this idea of peace infrastructure. And for instance, we can talk about Ghana, we can talk about Kenya, South Africa, Liberia, which have relied on these infrastructures to promote peace. When you go to Kenya, Kenya has peace committees. Ghana has a National Peace Council. If you go to Sierra Leone, for instance, they have a recently established Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion. And in Liberia has a National Palaver Heart structure that also helps it to leverage indigenous methods to promote peace. And so a lot of countries have embraced these ideas. And in most cases, this infrastructure is serving them well. And many others have also embraced the idea and embarking on the journey to sustainable peace. And I'm sure Mr. Amoh will be able to tell us the number of consultations he has had in recent times from other countries that are seeking to learn from the example of Ghana. As I said, numerous countries are in the process of establishing similar structures. But beyond just the desire to establish a peace infrastructure, I think establishing an I4P is not as simple as it sounds. We can look at one example of Ivory Coast. In the immediate aftermath of the 2011 civil war, the Ivorian authorities commenced the process of establishing a peace infrastructure. But that envisaged institution could not materialize. And it's because essentially they lack the foundational structure that will support the infrastructure, notably a clear mechanism for engaging traditional and religious authorities who play a very crucial role within the African continent. And so, having realized that the Ivorian authorities, led by President Al-Hassan Ouattara, established a National Council of Kings and Traditional Leaders in 2017. And that National Council for Kings and Traditional Leaders was supposed to leverage the role of traditional authorities who are very well respected, especially on the African continent, to lead processes of dialogue and reconciliation. Unfortunately, that council has suffered an unfortunate fate, a fate that existing state institutions have suffered, and that's politicization and interference in the selection of its leadership. I think with time permitting, we can go into the details later. But what I will say is that I think I'm just trying to support the idea that establishing a national peace infrastructure requires certain ingredients to be in place. I will not go much into that detail because Kwaku Danso will talk a bit about that in terms of the conceptual and operational aspects. But why I4P is critically important in supporting this drive towards sustainable peace, I think there are several ingredients that need to be in place to support its effective functioning. When you listen or you pay close attention, they are being called different names and they are taking different forms. But most important to all these peace infrastructures are the issues of inclusion and participation, which produce the legitimacy and ownership that have been very essential to the effective functioning of these existing models. So let me not go deeper into some of the operational elements. Let me pause here and then give the floor to Kwaku to take over. And then I think later on, we can go further into the discussion. Thank you so much for your attention. So let me invite Kwaku to take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. And thank you for that very insightful overview, which presents, I should say, a broad context for the subsequent presentations that we will be making. You are very right when you say that I4Ps have become an integral element in the promotion of peace and security, particularly on the African continent. And you were right in enumerating the challenges that formal institutions are encountering in their bid or in their effort to cope with the multiple and complex challenges that African states are encountering currently. And then I think a central part of the challenges being encountered is the very fact that the state itself, that has a primary responsibility for ensuring peace and security and so on and so forth, has become a potent source of insecurity and, for that matter, mass atrocity crimes on the continent. But then even going beyond that, to understand why infrastructures for peace have become so central to the maintenance of peace, is the very nature of the African state, which differs from its counterpart in Europe and North America. In Africa, there is multiple representation of the state, in the sense that the African state is not a monolith, as we are, often made to believe. The African state is certainly different from its counterpart in Europe, in the sense that the state society configuration in Africa differs from the state society complex in America, in France, in Britain. And it is important that we understand the nature of the state in Africa in order to understand the dynamics of conflict and insecurities, and, for that matter, how these challenges can be addressed. What this implies is that the former state, in other words, saying that there are multiple representations of the state, means that the legally constituted state, or if you like, the former post-independent state, is only one actor among multiple actors when it comes to the provision of security governance. And this suggests that under present circumstances, the formal arena cannot wholly suffice as an adequate site for delivering the kind of solution that is required to maintain peace and security on the continent. Added to that has been, earlier Frank spoke of the limitations relating to the liberal peace logic. Yes, one can talk of multiple instances of peace-building initiatives, peace operations across the African continent. Yet we know that the African continent and the states and societies on the continent are still struggling when it comes to issues of conflict, peace, security, and development. So the question is, why is it the case that despite all these multiple interventions, we are still grappling to maintain peace in the various countries on the continent? Part of the reason is that the ongoing approach to peace, as captured under the liberal peace logic, has basically sort of instrumentalized peace missions as a mechanism for diffusing Euro-American or Western values. And in most cases, these are sort of structured along a victim rescuer sort of model that limits the role played by African agency in the maintenance of peace and security on the continent. In fact, coupled with this process has also been the invention of absence to either foreclose or invisibilize African agencies. So the idea basically is that you need external intervention because on the African continent, there is no capacity. So capacity can only be mobilized externally. And this in turn transforms people on the continent into objects of security rather than subject of security, or both object and subject of security with agency to deliver security and, for that matter, prevent atrocity crimes and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that if you go around most countries in Africa, you would notice that the non-state often serves as a major source of security and, for that matter, peace and so on and so forth. But you see, when you take typical international relation, ideas, as one can find in realism, liberalism, and so on and so forth, the mainstream approaches in international relations, and even if you take diplomacy and so on and so forth, normally diplomats are not interested in micro-level type of conflict over grazing right, conflict over land, farmlands, and so on and so forth. They are often interested in the big-time conflict, regional conflict, national coup d'etats regionalized conflicts, and so on and so forth. Diplomats will normally not spend time over little issues among people within societies, within communities. But the fact of the matter is that it is those minor level or micro level conflict that in most instances blossom out to assume the national or regional scale conflict that we are talking about. If you take the ongoing coup d'etats and so on that Frank highlighted a while ago, if you go deeper, you would notice that these are issues that culminate out of the multiple grievances that at the individual level, people have with the sort of governance that they are experiencing. You might talk about violent extremism and so on and so forth that has engulfed large part of the Sahel and other parts of West Africa. As another example, often the representation of this crisis is, takes the form of the totalizing narrative that are couched within the ongoing global war on terrorism and so on and so forth. And this often deflects attention from the real life challenges that people face in their communities and so on and so forth. So in order to be able to respond, first of all, to understand effectively what the sources of these challenges are, then it becomes important for us to invest time and energy understanding the local or community level resources that people, or even if you like, the tried and tested mechanisms that people have resorted to for generations to resolve conflict in their communities. I think one of the challenges we've had is that even though issues around peace, security, and so on, conflict have become a dominant one, and a lot of investments are made in as part of the peace building processes, often attention is focused on state level institutions. So the question is, how do you improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the security sector institutions in order that they are able to deal with crime and so on and so forth? How do you capacitate the criminal justice system? But the fact of the matter is that when you go to communities, there are multiple instances. In other words, the average person might not even go to court, right? They have local level mechanisms that serve as forum for justice, for social cohesion, and so on and so forth. So the idea is, how are we able to tap into the multiple sites and skills of society, in the sense that the non-state agencies then become complementary mechanisms for peace building, and for that matter, social cohesion that ensures stability and provides a stable environment for economic development and so on and so forth. So I think that is where the whole idea of infrastructure for peace really comes in, because the infrastructure for peace, recognizes other agencies beyond the formal institutions. In actual fact, it's normally, in most instances, empirical cases, as you would see around, it's normally a bottom-up approach that sort of leverage the resources that local communities provide, that they have used in addressing their own challenges, their own conflict and insecurities and injustices over time. So the idea is, how do you fuse, or how do you blend these local level resources to complement the formal or state level institutions, in order that you can then, out of it, develop an eclectic sort of mechanism that is able to address the multiple instances of challenges that we have, particularly when it comes to the question of mass atrocity crime prevention. So I think that is part of the reasons why increasingly infrastructures for peace are gaining traction. And I know Mr. Amoh will be speaking to that shortly. But then it has become very visible that increasingly across the region, both in cases where you've had outright civil wars, such as Liberia, such as Sierra Leone, that Frank spoke about, but also in countries that have experienced authoritarian regimes such as the Gambia. And one might think that, well, I mean, countries such as Ghana that has not really experienced any civil wars and so on might not necessarily need the infrastructures for peace. But as I know Mr. Amoh would explain to us, the infrastructure for peace, and for that matter, the National Peace Council of Ghana, has become extremely instrumental, particularly in instances of elections. There are instances where elections have been held, but there are multiple disputes, and the point of call for diffusing those disputes in many instances has been the National Peace Council. Even in a country such as Ghana, where you would expect that after multiple instances of successful elections, one would expect that we will be consolidating democracy. Elections have become one of the most potent sources of threat to security instability. Whenever elections are approaching, there is this tension because there's so much unpredictability as to whether the electoral events are going to end successfully or whether they will tip the country into an abyss, and so on and so forth, demonstrating how even the so-called stable countries such as Ghana and the other countries within the region that have not even experienced outright violence still remain very susceptible. And for that matter, questions around the infrastructure for peace have become extremely central for sustaining peace on the continent. And I think what we really need to do is to understand these mechanisms, because yes, they are very instrumental. They've been used by communities for generations or for decades and centuries and so on and so forth. But they all come with their multiple challenges. But the other question is, how do you nationalize at otherwise community level or local level mechanisms? Because when you go across the African continent, or even if you take Ghana or Liberia or Sierra Leone, for example, each community may have its own sort of local or indigenous mechanism for mass atrocity crime prevention, for conflict prevention, and for maintaining justice, and so on and so forth. So the question is, how are you then able to bring all these resources together, transform them in a manner by bringing them up to speed to address the current challenges that we have? I think these are some of the critical questions that if we have time, we can explore and discuss further. But I think for now, I will leave my presentation here for my other colleagues to make this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwaku Danso, for that very comprehensive and insightful presentation. So now, let me now turn over to Mr. George Amoh to continue from here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. Once again, my name is George Amoh. The National Peace Council has become a model for the infrastructure for peace we are talking about, conceived by our friend Paul Ledratch. Somewhere in 2002 or 2002, Ghana experienced a kind of atrocity in the northern part of Ghana, where conflicts had become a perennial feature. What happened in 2002 was to the effect that 40 people were killed in a violent communal conflict between people who are supposed to be from the same ancestry, from the same father, as it were. It led even to the death of the overlord, or the one who was the chief. That issue came up with a lot of questions. How did it happen? Why couldn't the whole country and its security apparatus, prevent such a heinous, crime happening? So the idea started floating. How do we prevent such conflicts or such violence from recurring. Already the Christian Council, the Catholic Bishops Conference, and other civil society groups were on the ground mobilizing for peace activities. So they became like a fulcrum around which the idea to develop a kind of an infrastructure for peace was mooted. So if you have familiar with Ghana, the northern part of Ghana, we have one popular bishop of the Catholic Church who became our Northern Regional Peace Council chair, Philip Name, who started the call. So somewhere in 2004, the idea to governor support for a kind of an infrastructure that would from time to time intervene in conflict-related matters was gaining grounds and currency in the country. So in 2004, let me also say, there was an election. Ghana was going into an election that was very, very keen. So the fear was that if care was not taken, looking at the recent history, I mean, what had happened in 2002, we may have it very tough in the northern part. So the peace initiatives that were going on were able to set up what we call the Northern Regional Peace Advisory Council, in short, NOPAC. NOPAC was able to hold the northern part of Ghana together in such a way that the election of 2004 passed without much difficulties. Yeah, so in 2006, 2005, that's where it began. The Ministry of the Interior had been able to put together the efforts from the ground, has been able to crystallize them to become a kind of a response mechanism for conflict intervention. So it was given the term the National Peace Architecture. And in 2006, the administrative structure for what we now know as the Peace Council had been developed. And per a fiat by the Minister for National Security, the framework for developing a national infrastructure for peace had been put together. So that is how the National Peace Council of Ghana began. It developed from the base, out of an experience we gathered. Then the government came on board and crystallized the whole thing to become an infrastructure that we now know to be the Peace Council. So after the 2006 framework, so civil society groups, the religious institutions, and some state agencies were calling for a legislative backing to make the Peace Council a state institution with a civil society flair, kind of. So in 2011, indeed, in November 2010, a bill was introduced to Parliament. And in March 16th, 2011, the bill received a presidential assent and it became the National Peace Council in the form we see today. But let me hasten to say that peace infrastructures, the Ghanaian one is a model. But if you go to Sierra Leone, for example, who recently developed one, theirs is a bit of difference. The difference is that the Ghanaian model started from the scratch. Indeed, civil society groups, including churches, mosques, opinion leaders, galvanize the support or mobilize the action for a peace infrastructure. And the critical ingredients that we require, I think you require for a successful infrastructure for peace, have been, fortunately for us in Ghana, a part of the Peace Council Act of 2011. What are these? If you want a peace infrastructure to serve the purpose for which those who conceptualize the idea, have, then you must make it an inclusive process when you want to start one. For example, in Ghana, no one was left out from the onset. All religious shades were brought together. The government had to open up, to bring on board people of diverse opinions, particularly people with credibility and with the influence that in the event of a conflict, when they stand up, they will gain the required respect for people, to take their words. So if you look at the Peace Council Act as we have it, the membership or the composition is very, very critical. If you fail in getting the composition right, I'm sure you have failed from the beginning. I think we did something right because the composition are made up of people who already have the credibility. In Ghana, I think those who drafted the bill realized that religion is key influencer in this country. And the leaders of religious groups have huge influence regarding the behavior and the attitude of our people. So that's very critical. Another critical area that the government, I think, the people who started the whole process noticed and captured who are not tainted, either in terms of politics or in terms of integrity issues. So you need people with a kind of integrity to compose the peace infrastructure. Otherwise, you lose it. If you have people who are tainted with politics, there are some infrastructure for peace within the sub-region who are currently suffering because people do not see them to be the impartial arbiter or the neutral body that they want to have. So that is very, very critical, and one key ingredient one must not overlook when we are thinking of a veritable infrastructure for peace. The infrastructure for peace stands to gain if politics is taken away from it. Who becomes a member of the infrastructure for peace, or the composition of membership, should have nothing to do with the political affiliation of the individuals who are assembled. In Ghana, the politicians virtually have no control. What happens is that when it is time, there's a 4-year term. If it is time for the board to be reconstituted, what we do is that we write to the respective institutions named in the Act, namely the Catholic Bishop Conference, the Christian Council of Ghana, the Ghana Pentecostal Council, the African Traditional Religious Believers, the Ahmadiyya Muslim Mission, the Al-Sunnah, and the Tijaniya Muslim groups. The government, or the president, so to speak, has only 2 appointments to make out of the 13 membership. So in terms of decision-making, you realize that government has no locus to control what happens at the Peace Council. So that is very important. What we have been doing over the years is to use methods including negotiation, mediation, diplomacy, and other diplomatic moves to address differences or complaints that come to us from time to time. As I said to you, there is a complaint before us. Some political parties going into the next year's elections are worried because they believe the Electoral Commission should open up more offices, or what we call here registration centers, in areas far or closer to the people. The Electoral Commission believes that it can only create offices, open. Just last Monday, a week today, the board of the council had to meet with the Electoral Commission, and we had to negotiate. And we do most of these things behind the scenes. Just after the meeting, somebody wanted us to speak to the matter. We said, no, we will not do that. We are engaging the parties and the Electoral Commission. So most of the success we have achieved has been behind closed doors. In 2020, ahead of the 2020 elections, there was this malaise, this, permit me to call an animal, which was trying to eat up the good politics, democracy that we have established over the years. The National Democratic Congress and the New Patriotic Party, the two main political parties in the country, had issues with what had become known as vigilantism. The National Peace Council had to intervene by bringing the two parties together to fashion out a strategy as to how to deal with the monster. I think the last elections, the outcome of that elections, somehow proved that we had been able to at least deal, not 100%, I will not say, but we have been able to deal somehow with that monster we call vigilantism. Why? How did we do it? By dialoguing with the political parties and the main political interest groups. How do we manage it? Together, we facilitated. The Peace Council did not impose anything, but we facilitated the process, and we were able to have a kind of a mechanism that would contain the menace. So in terms of religion, the National Peace Council has been very active. This issue of hijab came up, and the hijab issue had been an underground, fire waiting to burn all of us. You go to schools, and when it is Ramadan, the Muslims in the schools may want to fast. They may want to wear their hijab. And some institutions will say, no, that is not part of our way of dressing here. So the Peace Council had to intervene. We brought the leadership together from both the Christians and the Islamic faith, and we were able to strike a common ground. The latest one was in one of the popular senior high schools in the country, where fasting became an issue. We brought the interest parties together again, and we found a common ground for us to move. We are currently developing an MOU to guide behavior in the secondary schools of our country, Ghana. Probably let me also talk about chieftaincy. Currently, as we speak, chieftaincy is one of the biggest bans. Indeed, I see it to be the biggest threat to the current democratic experience of our country. There is no area in this country, in Ghana today, that you wouldn't find one chieftaincy or the other. It's all over the place. And if you come to the National Peace Council, in all our 16 regional offices, we have been inundated with chieftaincy cases. Currently, we are dealing with over 300 of them across the country. And this is how we approach it. Normally, we tried to build capacity of those who are able to do mediation or negotiation or dialogue at the chieftaincy level, the local level. Sometimes we build capacity of the chiefs themselves and what we call the queen mothers. We believe that when you're able to do that successfully, they in turn will serve to promote nonviolent ways of addressing issues. So when we are unable to succeed by creating awareness and trying to use dialogue, then we escalate the process to a mediation. And we have successfully dealt with some cases. For example, the one in Bimbala, the Tripoli case, together with some other interest groups, were able to set up a committee that tried to deal with the issue. Now we've been able to contain it. From time to time, you see it coming up here and there. Alabanyo in Konya, another, in fact, the longest conflict in this country. It has been contained largely by the efforts of the Peace Council and other stakeholders. Probably let me end by saying, that we work in collaboration with a lot of partners. Peace work is very fluid, and if you are talking about infrastructure for peace, then you are talking about gamut of institutions, ideas, a set of behaviors that come together to build a resilient society that is able to ward off violence and atrocities, as it were. So together with our partners, and Kofi Annan has been our key partner, work closely with the West African Network for Peace Building, the traditional rulers themselves, the religious rulers, and together we're able to do something. So for a peace infrastructure to be successful, you would need to network and collaborate. It's very, very important. If we're able to succeed in doing that, your chances of succeeding as a peace infrastructure is very high, because you have the will of the generality of the people to back you. I think this is very critical. Probably let me end here. I've taken a lot of time, and leave it. If questions come up, we would then come in to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Mr. Amoh for highlighting these very important aspects of the operationalization of peace infrastructures by bringing in the practical example of the National Peace Council. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I will now open the floor for comments, contributions, or questions, if there are any, and I'm sure to the best of our abilities, we'll be happy to attend to them. There is, I think there is one question that came, maybe let me highlight it. There's a question that says, one thing I wondered was also to what extent peace infrastructures should draw on indigenous models or precedents of conflict resolution. How can historical research further such approaches? So this is a question on the floor sent by Fabian. I don't know if Kwaku or George, which one of you would like to go first?
Okay, I think I would like to share some insights on that. You know, and I would like to make reference to my earlier comment that one of the things that, you know, you can connect to the infrastructure for peace, or a central plank of the infrastructure for peace, is this collective approach, you know, if you like, whole of society approach to finding or working out solutions to problems in society. And if you come to Africa, as I noted earlier, and you go around in various communities, communities have indigenous mechanisms of resolving conflict. So earlier, Frank, you made mention of the Palava Heart mechanism in Liberia. I mean, there's research that shows that about 90% of people in Liberia, particularly in rural Liberia or the countryside, would normally air their grievances and seek redress through indigenous mechanisms, and it is often people in the urban centers, you know, people who can afford it, who would normally resort to the former criminal justice system when they seek to, you know, the former courts and so on and so forth. Of course, it is true that there are certain types of crimes that are difficult to address within the indigenous fora. For example, when it comes to issues of murder, issues of rape, issues of armed robbery, if you like, generally felony. These are issues that have to be routed through the former statutory court processes. But I think the sense in which the indigenous mechanisms and the legally constituted institutions can work together is for these indigenous mechanisms to serve as complementary forum for addressing issues in society. And therefore, issues bordering on felony can be, you know, the preserve of the former courts. If you go to our courts, one of the difficulties they are encountering is that they are inundated with multiple types of cases. And in many instances, people are even remanded in prison. Sometimes people stay in prison for months and years just because the court has not been able to provide space to hear their case and so on and so forth. But then if we were to integrate the indigenous processes, the indigenous approaches in a systematic way into the former structures, then the idea is that there are certain types of, if you like, not very critical cases that are we are able to address effectively. And this is very important because you see, when you go to the African communities, most of these communities are relational communities in the sense that relationships within communities are very dense and very deep. And therefore, there have been instances where the victim who took a case to court ended up being branded, if you like, as the perpetrator of assault because, for example, there are communities that I studied in some African countries where if someone took another person within the community to court for stealing, let's say, you know, plantain or something, if the children of the perpetrator were not able to go to school, people turn around and blame the one who took the matter to court for the reason why the children are not going to school because their father is serving a term imprisonment in, you know, that sort of thing. So for the community, in order to establish communal harmony or community harmony and resilience, then matters that the community through the mechanism, let's say the chiefs and, you know, queen mothers and opinion leaders can address within the community that do not necessarily border on felony. They want to address that within the community in order to ensure social cohesion and stability within the community. So that's very important. In terms of the historical research and historical, you know, methods and so on and so forth, I think one of the challenges we have in the implementation of this indigenous mechanism, as I noted earlier, is the fact that increasingly over time, especially if you go to countries that experience civil wars and so on and so forth, there was this time gap or time lap where the processes, you know, could not be practiced as they used to be. And therefore, part of a segment of the youth, for example, do not even understand how some of these mechanisms work properly. And also, I noted that in many communities, there are multiple versions of indigenous approaches. So the idea is that ethnographic study, for example, becomes extremely important to understand the various indigenous mechanisms that you have within the various communities, how they are related to others, how they differ from others, and how ultimately they can be nationalized to become a national mechanism or a national instrument for promoting peace and for preventing mass atrocities in communities.
Thank you so much, Kwaku. There are two more questions here. Let me read them, and then I attempt to respond to one of them, and then perhaps Mr. Amoh can also come in. There's a question here, from Christopher Harrison. Since we know there is an important need to continue to develop the well-being of women and girls, what, if any, initiatives are currently underway to assist unarmed men and boys that are subject to punitive and even deadly forms of required service, as insisted upon by multiple states and militia groups? And the second one by Paul Macharia. What is the impact of domestic business corporations and multinational corporations in peace building? Do you see a role for local businesses and MNCs as stakeholders in the multi-stakeholder peace process, in addition to NGOs, religious organizations, and governments? If so, what role do you envision for domestic and multinational corporations in peace building and security? So let me attempt the first one, and perhaps Mr. Amoh can also come in. One major challenge that we've had with respect to dealing with especially armed militia groups is the fact that over the years, we've not found a way to hold them accountable. Because normally armed militia groups do not subscribe to any form of international or even national protocols. Often they get away with all forms of impunity. But there is a way for peace infrastructures to address that. And that is because of the decentralized nature of peace infrastructures. Essentially, these are people who live in the communities and know who is doing what. And they are often able to leverage those local resources to bring perpetrators a book. We've not managed to leverage this sort of resource whereby communities are able to bring perpetrators of various atrocity crimes to book under a peace infrastructure framework. But I think that they still have this resource that we could sort of leverage in the future. There are a few instances where local communities have been able to do this. And I think Kwaku mentioned the idea of the Palavahat system, which is community-based approach to conflict resolution and reconciliation. And often the communities are able to identify groups that have perpetrated some forms of atrocity crimes and to find a way to promote reconciliation within that given community. So peace infrastructures could leverage this sort of resource as well. And for states, I think the mechanism has been working where national peace infrastructures like the National Peace Council we have on various occasions brought state actors to the table to discuss very pressing issues of national concern. And Ghana is an example of that. We could leverage that. I don't know if Mr. Amoh, you want to talk about the local businesses and multinational corporations.
Yes, Frank, thank you so much. But before I address that, let me also add to what Kwaku said. You know, there are so many issues that the formal courts are unable to address. In Ghana, you know, there are chieftaincy cases that have gone to the highest courts, the Supreme Court, and they haven't been successful. Indeed, almost all of them. they come back for a traditional resolution. The latest one before us is what we term the Doba Kandiga matter in the Upper East region of Ghana. The matter, had been to court severally, but finally the people themselves decided to address the matter, and they used a very simple but important customary way of addressing the matter. They went to the riverside, and some animal was slaughtered. They did some exchanges here and there, and that is it. So a combination of both the formal and the informal, or the traditional and the formal system, is very important in achieving a resilient society. But let me attempt to address the last question. Businesses stand to gain when there is peace. I mean, without peace, it's difficult for any kind of business to thrive, whether local or national. So it is important that businesses participate effectively in the peace-building processes of any country. What Ghana we have done, if you look at our act, Section 20 establishes the Peace Council Peace Fund. And the expectation is that businesses from within and outside of Ghana would make contribution into that fund. So businesses have a huge role to play. Indeed, a complementary role with civil society and government and peace actors to ensure we are able to sustain the peace for development to take place. So we all stand to gain if we contribute to making the peace structures or the peace infrastructure strong and resilient. And we can only do that with resources. So the role of businesses is very critical in any form that it can take, very important. I remember last year when Ghana was commemorating the International Day of Peace. I think last year, when was it we did it? We brought together, in fact, we wrote to businesses in this country to support us. Some supported us with their resources. Some brought us some drinks. Some supported with money. Some supported with what do you call it? Football things for us to use to engage the youth. So we all stand to gain if we make contribution. The businesses should not be left out at all. And I think Sierra Leone is a very good example of how businesses, local business interests, are contributing to peace in the peace infrastructure over there. Thank you very much. Sarah is back.
So much. Thank you so much. Sarah, how much more time do we have?
I think we have to actually wrap it up.
Okay.
But certainly if you have questions that weren't answered, feel free to email IGMAP and we can pass those questions along. But I want to thank you all so much for being amazing panelists, and thank you to those who came to join us for our webinar. We will have many events this semester, so feel free to check out our website to see what's coming up next. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.